Happy to be joined this morning by Jeremy Scahill, who, of course, alongside our own Ryan Grim, is co-founder of Dropsite News. Great to see you, Jeremy.
Good to see you.
Good to be back.
Yeah, of course. So you have some bombshell reporting about these ceasefire negotiations and really pointing the finger at, in a conclusive way, at Bibi Netanyahu for intentionally undermining a deal that he had already agreed to. I can put this up on the screen, and you can elaborate here a bit more. But effectively, Hamas agreed to a three-phase deal that actually backed down on what was one of their key demands, that there be a permanent ceasefire. This was something that supposedly the Israelis had already agreed to. And yet after Hamas says, okay, yes, we accept, then Netanyahu, specifically enabled, as you point out, by the U.S., layers on a bunch of additional conditions intentionally met to undercut the achievement of a deal. Talk to us about the documents that you were able to gain access to and put this in a broader context for us.
I mean, the broad context is that for the past 10 plus months, the narrative from the United States and Israel has been that Hamas has been blocking a ceasefire. And, that has not been true throughout this entire time. Certainly, Hamas and Israel had very different perspectives on what they wanted in any document that established a framework for a ceasefire. But it's been propaganda from the beginning to state that somehow unilaterally Hamas was sabotaging it. But let's fast forward to the very current situation. You have Kamala Harris anointed as the Democratic nominee for president in Chicago earlier in August, and you had AOC and others praising her for working tirelessly for a ceasefire, saying the White House was working around the clock for a ceasefire. And what they were talking about is that President Joe Biden in May announced that that he was going to present a framework for a ceasefire that had actually been presented by Israel. And he said, now the onus is on Hamas to accept this deal. And what that framework essentially said was that there would be three phases. And in the initial first 6-week phase, there would be a large exchange of captives, many of the civilians that are being held by Hamas inside of Gaza. There are also some that are classified as in a humanitarian category. One of those we understand was Hersh Goldberg Polin, the dual U.S.-Israeli national whose death in Gaza was announced on Sunday by Israel. And so you had this framework. Hamas then looks at it. They gave some notes on it then, within the next 10 days, and they said that they wanted to be able to negotiate a permanent ceasefire in the first phase of the deal. Now, according to my sources in Hamas, they were told by the international mediators, Qatar and Egypt, this was a deal breaker for Israel and the United States. And so Hamas deliberated on that. The United Nations Security Council endorsed the so-called Biden framework. And by July 2nd, Hamas had actually backed off of what it was one of their most important demands and made what they thought was a really big concession by taking that language out of what they were insisting on. They then go back to the mediators, and the documents I have show that on July 2nd, Hamas formally informed both Egypt and Qatar, the two main mediators dealing with the United States and Israel, that they would accept the terms of the framework based on an American amendment. And Hamas sources told me that the Americans acknowledged that Hamas had accepted that framework, and they went back to Israel. And then Netanyahu bombards the process with a whole slew of new conditions, including an indefinite presence of Israeli troops in the Philadelphia corridor, which has been governed by agreements going back to 1979 and 2005 with Egypt and Israel. Israeli forces are not supposed to be in the Philadelphia corridor or controlling the Rafah crossing. And they also insisted that they would maintain troops in what's called the Netzarim corridor, which essentially splits Gaza in half. So Hamas said, no deal on this. We already agreed to something. And so what we've seen is Antony Blinken running over to Tel Aviv and traveling around the Middle East. And now what's happening is they've tried to say to Hamas, yeah, we know that you agreed to this, but now you have to accept parts of these other demands that you've made very clear you will not accept, which is an indefinite Israeli troop presence inside of Gaza.
Yeah, so Jeremy, can we put E3, please, up on the screen? This was very interesting in terms of some of the reporting that was coming out, where they say that the heads of the security intelligence services urging Netanyahu for months to reach the deal deal. We warned him and the cabinet officials about this exact scenario, but they would not listen. So how does this comport with some of the other reporting that you've done on the subject?
Well, I mean, what's really ironic is that you have Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense of Israel. Now, this is someone who made genocidal statements at the onset and said that, essentially they were going to collectively punish the people, the Palestinians of Gaza, by shutting off food, electricity, water, etc. He has emerged internally as Netanyahu's most formidable opponent from within the Israeli national security state. And we understand that just days ago, there was a cabinet meeting. It's public that the cabinet meeting was called by Netanyahu to get an endorsement for his pledge to stay in that Philadelphia corridor that I was referring to along the Egyptian border. And according to Israeli media reporting, Yoav Gallant exploded at Netanyahu during that meeting, said that he is doing this because he knows Hamas is not going to accept it. He warned Netanyahu that if any more hostages die, Netanyahu would have their blood on his hands. And he identified Netanyahu as the main obstacle to a ceasefire. And then just days later, this past Sunday, you had Israel announcing the deaths of 6 hostages and captives inside of Gaza, including this U.S.-American dual citizen, Hirsch Goldberg Polin.
Jeremy, talk a little bit about the way that the U.S. has enabled this behavior, because as you said, I mean, Yair Lapid and certainly Yoav Gallant within the government have emerged as direct critics of Bibi's strategy here, which is clearly designed to undercut the negotiations in an attempt to keep himself in power at, obviously the expense of Palestinian lives, but more consequential in the eyes of Yoav Gallant at the expense of Israeli hostage lives. How has that behavior been endorsed and enabled by the U.S. government, which has at every turn continue to lay all the blame at the feet of Hamas, versus where at this point it very clearly, more accurately lies at the feet of Bibi?
I mean, in the very simple big picture, the direct answer to that is that instead of enacting any meaningful consequences on Netanyahu or Israel for their systematic war crimes in Gaza, the Biden administration has accelerated weapons transport to Israel. August was the busiest month in a long time at the main airport in Israel that receives U.S. weaponry. And the flight data that's been revealed publicly about this shows that Biden was shipping emergency weapons to Israel at a time when he was telling the world that he had come up with a formulation to end the war. You have Harris also, who was saying, we need a ceasefire, we need it quickly. But behind the scenes, and I haven't just spoken with Hamas, I've talked to other people involved with the mediation. What the U.S. has been doing is saying, yes, President Biden said this is the deal and Hamas just needs to accept it. But now Israel is doing something different. And so we want you to accept all of these other things that we had already resolved through months of negotiation that led up to the so-called Biden framework. So you see Kamala Harris and Joe Biden at a very top level continuing to endorse Israel, even as it commits a horrifying genocide, even as it invades the West Bank and continues to sort of Gaza-icize the West Bank. And then on a technical level, you have Antony Blinken, Brett McGurk, other U.S. officials backing away from what they had said was a deal that Hamas could sign. Hamas agreed to it, and then they changed the terms of it. So at every move in the big picture and on a technical level, Israel is in control of the agenda, and it's in control of the agenda because the U.S. is allowing it to be.
Jeremy, just for people who would say, okay, well, why doesn't Hamas just accept these new conditions? Why don't they just allow for this, Israeli troop presence in these 2 areas? What's the big deal? What would your response to those people be?
To accept that would be to accept that international law doesn't exist, would be to accept that the genuine aspirations for self-determination, independence, and freedom on the part of the Palestinian people are illegitimate. Look, the Palestinians, you can say what you want about Hamas's tactics. There are International Criminal Court indictments waiting for leadership members that have not been killed of Hamas for what prosecutors believe were war crimes that they committed on October 7th. But to imply that because October 7th happened, that somehow international law doesn't matter, that somehow it means that Palestinians have no right to independence or no right to self-determination. or more specifically, no right to armed resistance against occupation, would mean that the so-called rules-based order that Biden and others embrace all the time doesn't actually exist. So, there is a process that can be negotiated. There are political solutions that can be negotiated. But Israel to come back into Gaza, I think the belief on the part of Hamas and most Palestinians is if they're allowed to do that they will never leave. And when you see Netanyahu holding up maps, as he did just in the last 24 hours, he shows that the West Bank doesn't exist at the same time that he's talking about keeping troops inside of Gaza. So, everyone wants to just say, well, what about October 7th? What about October 7th? Well, what about October 6th? What about 1948? What about 1967? I mean, these are legitimate questions. They're not just rhetorical devices. There's real law that governs this. And for Hamas to accept an indefinite Israeli occupation in Gaza would be to say that the Palestinian cause is dead.
So, Jeremy, since you actually have sources in Hamas and you're one of the only journalists that genuinely tries to actually speak with them and then report the perspective, it's not an endorsement, it's literally just talking with them. What would you say then that the current state of Hamas leadership and their thinking towards a ceasefire deal is now that Netanyahu's government and others have put in various different provisions which make the possibility less likely? Do they just fully endorse armed resistance and now the killing of these hostages? Is that the direction things are likely? Where do you think their mindset is right now?
Look, let's remember that last month, Netanyahu and his forces assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, who was not the military leader of Hamas, but was the top political officer of Hamas and was the lead negotiator. He was then replaced in a consolidation of power on the ground in Gaza and externally by Yahya Sinwar, who has been the Gaza commander of Hamas, leader of Hamas, and is believed widely to be one of the top architects of the October 7th attacks. When Israel in June attacked Nuseirat, the Nuseirat refugee camp, to extract some of its hostages and killed hundreds of people, wounded many hundreds others. Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson for the Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas that has been leading the resistance against the Israeli forces in Gaza, said that there were going to be new rules given to the Palestinian fighters who were guarding Israeli hostages. They didn't specify what those rules were, but it appears that it may have included to kill hostages if Israeli forces start attacking sites where hostages are being held. And just last night, Abu Ubaidah released a series of written statements on social media channels about the 6 hostages and saying that he wanted to remind the world that they had warned Israel that if they continued to try to release the hostages through military means, that the choice they were making was for them coming home alive or in coffins. It was widely interpreted as Abu Ubaidah taking responsibility for at least some of the deaths of the hostages. At the same time, though, Hamas political officials had said just hours before that statement was issued by the spokesperson of the Qassam brigades that they laid blame for the deaths of the hostages on Israel and had implied that some of them may have been killed in airstrikes or were shot by Israeli forces. So, what I'm sensing is that there appears to be a disconnect between some of the Hamas officials who are operating in Doha or Lebanon or elsewhere and what's happening on the ground. It could also be that there's a compartmentalization of the military operations. And so the Hamas political leaders may not even be aware of everything that commanders of the Qassam brigades on the ground are doing. But one twist to this story that I think it's a little in the weeds, but I think it's worth mentioning. The American Israeli citizen whose death was announced on Sunday, whose parents spoke at the Democratic National Convention, on May 13th, the Qassam brigades had announced that they had lost contact with that American Israeli citizen and the Palestinians that were guarding him, as well as 4 other Israeli captives that were being held. On Sunday morning, a top Hamas official said that they had not heard from the guards or that hostage, the American Israeli citizen, since that time back in May when they lost contact with him, and that they learned about his death from the Israeli announcement. So, there had been speculation that he may have been killed in that Nuseirat attack where some Israeli hostages were taken by Israel alive and brought out of Gaza in a rescue operation, as Israel described it. So we don't really know what exactly happened there. And there have been contradictory statements being made by Hamas. But just to directly answer the question, if you talk to political officials, their position has been they are ready to go back to July 2nd and discuss in more detail the terms of the framework that they accepted, which they said was also endorsed by the United States and originated from President Biden himself. That's what they're saying. Hamas's military wing seems to indicate that they are now doubling down on the notion that if Israel continues to try to, quote unquote, rescue hostages through military means, that those hostages are going to go back to Israel in a coffin.
The U.S. officials are saying that they're going to put some sort of a, quote unquote, take it or leave it deal on the table, whatever that means, in the absence of any willingness to use actual U.S. leverage and say, take it or leave it, meaning we're going to actually enforce this. We're going to, guarantee something gets done here. Do you have any hopes or optimism, given the level of backlash in Israel and the huge protests we're seeing on the ground? Do you have any expectation that this round of negotiations could end in a different outcome?
Based on what Netanyahu has been saying the past 24 hours, it seems very, very slim. I think there is a possibility that the Egyptian and Qatari mediators might be able to thread the needle between the United States and Hamas. And really, I mean, it's one thing that was described to me by people involved with the negotiations is that the Israeli negotiating teams at times seem to be open to conditions that could actually represent a breakthrough quickly. And then they go back and Netanyahu says, no way. And so part of the sense that I'm getting from sources is that the Israeli negotiators aren't even fully empowered by Netanyahu to make agreements. So, and again, remember, Hamas is not directly participating in these negotiations. They are doing it through international mediators. I think the real sticking point, I had some indication that the Netzarim corridor issue may be one that Israel is going to step away from, but the Philadelphia corridor thing seems to be Netanyahu's line in the sand. Hamas tells me they're not going to accept it, but it involves Egypt as well. So let's see what the Egyptians say. I think everyone on the ground in Gaza, regardless of their political perspective, wants this to end. This is a genocide. There was a polio threat that now hopefully is going to be addressed through this vaccination program. But to talk about a ceasefire in Gaza at a time when Jenin is burning, when the West Bank is burning, when Israel is going in and just gratuitously destroying paved roads and civilian infrastructure, and concocting theories about Iran establishing a base in the West Bank, a territory Iran doesn't share any border with. It's surrounded by Israel and Jordan recently defended militarily Israel when Iran launched missiles at it. So, we're in the realm of Alex Jones lunacy here with Netanyahu's theories about Iran, while Gaza and the West Bank are burning. So it's difficult to imagine. I think what's most likely is you get something temporary that looks like the November truce, and Biden and Harris kind of claim some form of victory, and then Netanyahu resumes the torching of Gaza again. That unfortunately, I think, is probably the most likely outcome.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about, Jeremy, actually, is that invasion of the West Bank. Guys, we can put E4 up on the screen. These are some of the images of, civilian roads being destroyed and this massive armed force entering the West Bank. And you can continue to play this while I ask the question. There's the demolition of civilian roads. For what reason? To what end? Other than just pure destruction and annihilation? Hard to say. What do you make of this invasion, of this escalation? What do you believe that the ultimate goal here, Jeremy, really is?
On this one, I think you have to take Netanyahu at his word. I mean, he's talked about a final solution for the issues that Israel has with the Palestinians, and I think his agenda for a long time has been to erase any notion of Palestine from the map. They are now pressuring the United States to try to build some sort of a fence or a structure along the Jordanian border to further entrap the Palestinians of the West Bank and make it so that Israel is in even greater control of their lives, to go from like 95% now to 100%. And I think that really what we're witnessing is that Netanyahu probably calculates this is his last shot at it. And that he wants to go down in history as the man that destroyed Palestine and the Palestinians with it. I really think we're looking at a genocidal agenda.
Jeremy, thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning and explaining your reporting and helping provide context for what's happening. Please let people know where they can find Drop Site News and how they can support the work that you and Ryan and your team are doing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Krystal. Dropsitenews.com. We're a nonprofit. You can donate to us. You can subscribe and pay to have a subscription, but nothing's behind a paywall. The most important thing you can do is hit the subscribe button and let everybody you know that Dropsitenews.com is available to the public, and we're trying to do hard-hitting journalism and take big swings at powerful people.
Yeah, awesome. we already see that, even though it's early days. Jeremy, thank you so much. Always great to see you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
And thank you guys so much for being great voices for justice and truth and being willing to debate.
We're doing our best over here. Thank you.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.